Are you a fan of a gray fantasy story told with real characters set against the backdrop of a historical-esque setting with magic and intrigue and a question of who will become the next ruler, battles on the horizon? Well, if you like those things, I mean, of course you're going to like The Song of Ice and Fire, but you're also really going to like The Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless, the first book of the Gale Song trilogy. Let's check it out.
This is Fantology.
You may have heard of us.
So, full disclosure, I know Shauna personally a little bit from interactions with her over the past couple of years on our Discord. We also had the privilege of interviewing her and got an advanced copy of the book. However, I can say confidently that that did not affect my positive review of this book, and I think this is going to be a hit for a lot of people out there because it's really unique in what it's doing. This historical fantasy where it's actually real history, not something that I've seen done a whole lot, and I think this really does a good job of it. Not only do we have a unique type of story here in this historical fantasy, but we also have a pretty unique part of world history. This is told in Ireland in the 10th century, so 900s AD. A time period that, frankly, I am not very familiar with. It's a time period that after having read this book, I really want to go and learn more about. However, I kind of can't because if I learn more about the actual history, I'm going to spoil the future books here. I'm going to spoil books 2 and 3. And you'll see what I mean after you read. So Ireland at this time was in the midst of a lot of turmoil because of the invasion by the Vikings. Ireland had never really been invaded before, and now the Vikings are coming over, establishing trade. They didn't actually take land, but they did intermarry into a lot of the traditional Irish powerful families. There's also an important intermingling of religions between Christianity and the old gods in Ireland. And the whole story is set against this backdrop of magic and fantasy, specifically Irish mythology, which is another thing that I'm not too aware of. It's a mythology that is not as clear-cut as the pantheons of like the Greek and the Egyptian and the Norse mythologies. And obviously, given that this is a historical fantasy, that mythology is actually real, although the majority of the people are not aware of it. There are these two different tribes of magic users that have both descended from gods back in the day. Both of them have been fairly diminished because of the rise of mankind, and they have this struggle that's going on behind the scenes that not many are aware of. We have two different point of view characters in the book, both female magic users from each one of these different tribes, and they could not be any more different. One of them, Gormvla, I think I pronounced it wrong, and I'm sorry, Shauna. The Irish pronunciations are difficult, but she is an actual historical figure. However, Shauna added in the fact that she's actually from this Fomorian descent and can use magic. So she's very ambitious, kind of a scheming type woman. I got a lot of Cersei Lannister vibes from her, and I thought she was a fantastic character. The other is Fodla, and she is very much the opposite. She's a pacifist. She's not very wise in the ways of the world and is fairly naive, but at her heart, her heart is much softer, and she's much more of a peacemaker. That's a lot of her struggle, is she's trying to kind of come into understand what humanity is and realize that they're not these bloodthirsty people, but also try to figure out how she can satisfy her natural desire for everyone to have peace. So the story wouldn't be any good if we didn't eventually have these two characters interact with each other and be at odds, and that's ultimately what we get towards the end of the book. There are also a lot of supporting characters along the way, and these characters meet up and have some conflict as well. And I thought one of the elements of the story that was the best done was when these characters met, I had this natural anxiety over like who I wanted to come out on top in certain situations, because I liked them to some degree, but I also didn't like them to other degrees, and I just didn't know who to cheer for. And I think that is a sign that this is a really well done story with characters that seemed very realistic and characters that I was naturally kind of cheering for, but also cheering against at the same time. Lots of complex emotions that Shauna was able to instill in me, and so I think that's well done. This is Shauna's first published book, and I think for a first, especially for a first author, this is fantastically done. The writing is really good. The writing is snappy and really gets you hooked and keeps the story moving. The book is 300-ish, maybe a little over 300 pages, so it's not a long book by epic fantasy, but the story it tells is pretty big. It spans several years here, but it's able to do that in a way that really keeps the plot moving the entire time. So there's never any downtime, but it also doesn't feel like too crazy of a breakneck pace where you can't enjoy the characters. So it strikes that balance really well. The pacing especially, I think Shauna did an excellent job with. I think one fun element to the story is Shauna's Irish. The story is set in Ireland, and as I was reading it, there were a lot of times where I basically read in an Irish accent in my head, and I'm not even going to try to do that for fear of offending people with my terrible Irish accent. But I think the story did an excellent job. The writing, it did an excellent job of creating this Irish feel without being too over the top, they're after me Lucky Charms type Irish. I don't think that accent was too bad there. So maybe I will try again at some point. Okay, so content level for The Children of God and Fighting Men. I don't think this is too dark of a story. It's probably on the level of like your John Gwynne or Mark Lawrence, if you don't count the Broken Empire trilogy, because that's just a whole different nihilistic dark thing. But Lawrence's other books kind of get to this like historical epic fantasy type feel where there's a lot of kind of brutal war type things happening, but people aren't necessarily dwelling on them overly much. So I wouldn't say it's grimdark, but it's quite realistic, and bad things happen and people are dying, but it's never too over the top, and there's no like over the top sexual violence or anything that would put up big red flags when giving this to your teenager. So who would like it? I think anyone that likes the books that I compared it to, right? Like your John Gwynne, Mark Lawrence, George R. R. Martin, especially. If you like intrigue, especially, and you want to keep on flipping the pages to know who won, or if you just like history and you're interested in learning about a new historical time period in a fun way with magic, if my history classes always had a magical element to them in the backdrop, I think I'd be much more interested. So that's who would like it. I think on the other hand, if you're someone who requires big epic action and magic systems, and you're just Brandon Sanderson all the way, and other authors haven't really landed for you as much because it's like too realistic and it doesn't quite have that big magical feel, you may not like this quite as much because it is so grounded in realism. The characters are real. The plot is real. The plot really happened for the most part. So if you require this big epic action, that didn't necessarily happen in real history, so you might be missing that here. Okay, overall rating. I said a lot of things I liked about this book, and I'm honestly, I can say pretty confidently that I think you're going to like it if you give this a shot. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 overall. Pretty good rating. I think there's a lot of things to like here. There's certainly some room for improvement, and I'm excited to see future books from Shauna. I think I would especially be maybe a little more drawn in if we did get to that really big, cool, climactic action where all of the plot threads came together. Didn't quite have that as much towards the latter stages of this book. But again, we're going off of real history, so I think Shauna does a good job of setting up for future works here. And I'm really tempted, honestly, to go into Google and just find out what happened in Ireland in the late 900s and early 1000s AD. But I'm going to try to hold off so I can discover it naturally in the future books of the Gale Song trilogy. The Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless comes out on September 1st. Worldwide available in ebook. Unfortunately, if you're in America like me, you're going to have to wait a couple months for that hardcover. But don't despair, because in November, it's going to look beautiful on your bookshelf. Thanks for watching. See you later.